May 2026, Washington. For decades, the UFO question existed largely in the shadows. Rumors, leaks, whistleblowers, unverified documents, stories passed between researchers, journalists, military veterans, and intelligence insiders. Some claimed governments knew more than they admitted. Others argued there was nothing to hide, and somewhere between those two positions sat a growing public demand. Show us the evidence. Release the records, open the files. Then something changed. The Department of War launched a dedicated online archive, an archive focused on unidentified aerial phenomenon. Hundreds of documents, videos, images, historical records, foreign government reports, military investigations, research files, and official correspondence. For the first time, a large collection of UAP-related material was being placed directly into public view. No freedom of information request, no leaked documents, no anonymous source. Officially released, officially hosted, officially acknowledged. But almost immediately, another question emerged. What exactly had been released? Because transparency and disclosure are not necessarily the same thing. A government can release information that does not automatically mean it is revealing everything it knows. Tonight we examine the Department of War UAP archive. What was released, what was not, what these files reveal about decades of investigations, and why some researchers believe the most important story may not be inside the documents themselves, but in the gaps between them. This is UFO to UAP, the evolution of the unexplained. I'm your host, Matt Tones. Please do subscribe, because tonight we investigate the declassified evidence. Before we examine the files themselves, we need to understand why this archive exists. For years, public pressure surrounding UFOs and UAPs steadily increased. Congressional hearings, military pilot testimony, the release of Navy videos, the creation of the UAP task force, the establishment of Arrow. The conversation had moved beyond internet forums and late-night radio. It had entered government institutions. Members of Congress began demanding greater transparency. Researchers pushed for centralized access to records. Journalists sought a mechanism that would allow the public to examine historical investigations directly. The result was a growing movement toward records disclosure. Not necessarily because governments wanted to reveal everything, but because the pressure to release something had become impossible to ignore. The archive emerged as part of that process, a public-facing repository designed to consolidate documents related to unidentified aerial phenomena, historical cases, military observations, intelligence assessments, scientific evaluations, images, videos, and supporting materials. The archive presented itself as an evolving collection rather than a finished release. More files would arrive over time, more documents would be reviewed, more material would become available, at least in theory. And that distinction matters because this is not a single disclosure event, it is an ongoing disclosure process. When researchers first entered the archive, expectations varied dramatically. Some expected proof of extraterrestrial visitation. Others expected nothing more than administrative paperwork. The reality sat somewhere between those extremes. What immediately stood out was the volume. The archive was not a symbolic gesture. It contained a substantial collection of material. Military reports, witness summaries, historical investigations, foreign correspondence, photographic evidence, technical analyses, and video recordings. The sheer quantity demonstrated something important. Governments have been collecting information on unexplained aerial phenomena for much longer than people realized. Not necessarily because they believed aliens were visiting Earth, but because unexplained objects in monitored airspace create operational questions. And operational questions generate paperwork, a lot of paperwork. The files revealed an institutional reality that many skeptics and believers alike sometimes overlook. Governments investigate uncertainty not because they know the answer, but because they do not. One of the biggest misconceptions surrounding the archive is the assumption that it contains a secret answer hidden somewhere among the pages. That is not what most researchers found. Instead, the archive contains something arguably more interesting: evidence of the investigative process itself, reports documenting unusual observations, analysis attempting to explain them, discussions about data quality, questions regarding sensor reliability, assessments of potential national security implications. The files reveal how institutions responded when confronted with uncertainty, and uncertainty appears throughout the archive, again and again. Objects observed but not identified, signals detected but not fully understood, reports deemed credible yet lacking sufficient evidence for definitive conclusions. This pattern's become one of the archive's most important themes: not confirmation, not denial, but unresolved investigation. One of the most overlooked aspects of the archive is its international scope. Many people assume UFO investigations exist primarily within the United States. The release material suggests otherwise. The archive includes references to observations and reports originating outside American airspace, foreign military encounters, diplomatic communications, international reporting channels, historical incidents involving allied governments. This matters because it broadens the conversation. The phenomenon, whatever its ultimate explanation, does not appear constrained by national borders, nor does governmental interest in the subject. Countries with vastly different political systems, military structures, and scientific institutions have all documented unusual aerial observations at various points in history. The archive reflects that reality, and in doing so, it challenges simplistic narratives suggesting the issue exists solely within one nation's bureaucracy. Yet perhaps the most striking lesson from the archive is one we have encountered repeatedly throughout this podcast: the evidence problem. Many cases contain compelling elements: multiple witnesses, military personnel, sensor observations, photographs, videos, and yet a definitive explanation remains elusive. This is not because investigators necessarily failed. Often the problem is the nature of the evidence itself: incomplete observations, limited sensor coverage, missing contextual information, short duration encounters, events that occurred unexpectedly and disappeared before comprehensive data could be collected. The archive demonstrates that collecting evidence and understanding evidence are two different challenges, and that distinction sits at the heart of modern UAP research. As we move deeper into the archive, a picture begins to emerge, not of certainty, but of sustained institutional interest. Governments investigated, scientists analyzed, military personnel documented, intelligence agencies assessed, and despite decades of effort, many questions remain unresolved. When we examine the archive, it quickly becomes apparent that not all files carry equal significance. Some documents are administrative, some are procedural, some simply confirm that investigations occurred. But scattered throughout the collection are cases that continue generating debate, not because they prove extraordinary claims, but because they remain difficult to fully explain. These are the cases that draw attention, the reports that survived decades, the encounters that continued attracting institutional interest, and the incidents that reveal just how complex the UAP question can become. One recurring theme appears throughout the archive: military witnesses. This should not surprise us. Military personnel spend more time observing the skies than almost any other profession. Pilots, radar operators, air defense personnel, naval observers, intelligence analysts, their responsibilities require constant situational awareness. And when unusual observations occur, reporting mechanisms already exist. What the archive demonstrates is that military encounters were neither isolated nor entirely ignored. Numerous reports documented observations that triggered formal reviews: objects exhibiting unusual movement, unexpected radar returns, visual sightings lacking immediate identification. Again and again, investigators attempted to determine whether these observations represented foreign technology, equipment malfunction, atmospheric phenomena, misidentification, or something else entirely. Most eventually received explanations, some did not, and those unresolved cases became part of the archive's enduring mystery. Some of the most important shifts reflected within the release files is the transition from witness testimony to sensor data. Historically, UFO investigations relied heavily on human observation. A pilot saw something, a civilian reported strange lights, a military observer documented an unusual event. Modern investigations increasingly involve technology, radar systems, infrared sensors, satellite imagery, targeting pods, electronic intelligence platforms. This evolution fundamentally changed the conversation because data creates opportunities for scientific analysis. The archive reveals repeated efforts to correlate observations across multiple systems. Investigators no longer asked only, "What did someone see?" They increasingly ask, "What did the sensors record?" That distinction transformed the investigative process, and it remains one of the most important developments in modern UAP research. Another fascinating aspect of the archive involves reports originating outside the United States. The public conversation often focused on American cases, Roswell, the Nimitz encounter, the Navy videos, congressional hearings, but the archive paints a broader picture. Governments around the world have documented unusual aerial observations. Military organizations across multiple nations have investigated incidents that defied immediate explanation. The released files includes references to diplomatic reporting, allied military observations, foreign government communications, international investigative efforts. The significance here is not that every report is extraordinary, it is that institutional interest appears remarkably constant. Different countries, different cultures, different political systems, yet many reached the same conclusion. Some observations warranted investigation, and some remained unresolved. Among the most discussed material is in the archive are historical incidents, cases preserved across decades, events that survived changes in government, changes in military leadership, and changes in investigative priorities. Some of these cases are familiar, others are obscure, yet they share a common characteristic. They generated enough uncertainty to remain part of the historical record. The archive reveals something important about institutional memory. Governments rarely preserve records indefinitely without reason. Files survive because they serve a purpose. Sometimes that purpose is administrative, sometimes legal, sometimes historical, and occasionally it is because investigators never fully resolved the original question. One category of material generated considerable public attention: references associated with space exploration. For decades, rumors circulated regarding unusual observations during the Apollo era. Most were never supported by evidence, yet the archive contains historical discussions involving observations made during space missions. Some involved unusual visual events, others concerned photographic anomalies. Still others document investigations attempting to determine whether observations had conventional explanations. And this is where the archive becomes particularly interesting, because the files do not present sensational conclusions. Instead, they reveal something more valuable: the investigative process itself, possible explanations considered, and sometimes uncertainty remaining after analysis is concluded. Another category receiving attention involves diplomatic and intelligence reporting. These files often reveal how governments communicate unusual observations internally. The language tends to be cautious, measured, analytical, far removed from sensational headlines. Investigators rarely leap to extraordinary conclusions. Instead, they document observations, assess reliability, evaluate potential implications, and identify areas requiring further review. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the archive. The documents do not read like confirmation of extraordinary claims, they read like institutions attempting to manage uncertainty. And that distinction is critical. Perhaps the most important insight emerging from the archive is not about UFOs. It is about governments, specifically how governments respond when confronted with unexplained observations. The release material demonstrates that institutional responses tend to follow familiar patterns: detection, assessment, investigation, analysis, classification, review, and sometimes continued uncertainty. The archive repeatedly shows organizations attempting to reduce ambiguity, not because they necessarily expect extraordinary answers, but because uncertainty itself creates operational challenges. Military systems are designed around identification: known, unknown, friendly, hostile. When something cannot be categorized immediately, investigation becomes necessary. The files reveal that process in action. Yet, despite the volume of material released, a reoccurring limitation appears throughout the archive: incomplete data. Many reports contained pieces of the puzzle, but not the entire picture. A witness encounter without radar confirmation, radar data without visual observation, photographs without contextual information, sensor records lacking supporting evidence. This problem appears repeatedly, and it helps explain why so many cases remain unresolved. The archive demonstrates that uncertainty is often not the result of secrecy. Sometimes it is simply the result of insufficient information. Investigators can only work with the data available, and in many cases, the available data remains incomplete. By the time researchers finish examining the archive, a clear pattern begins to emerge. The files do not reveal a hidden answer, they reveal a persistent question. For decades, institutions encountered observations that required investigation. Some received conventional explanations, some remained disputed, some remained and continue generating debate. But throughout the archive, one theme remains constant. Governments were not ignoring the phenomenon, they were studying it, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, and often without reaching definitive conclusions. The released files provide an extraordinary look into the mechanism of investigation: military encounters, international reports, historical anomalies, diplomatic communications, scientific assessment. Together, they form a picture of sustained institutional interest in unexplained aerial observations. But perhaps the most revealing part of the archive is not what was released, it is what remains absent. After spending days examining reports, videos, photographs, intelligence assessments, and historical records, a different question begins to emerge. Not what is in the archive, but what isn't. Because every archive tells two stories: the story contained within the documents and the story told by the documents that are absent. This is where the conversation surrounding disclosure becomes far more complicated, because transparency is rarely absolute. Governments do not simply unlock every cabinet and publish every record. Instead, disclosure tends to occur through review processes, classification assessments, security evaluations, legal requirements, and institutional decision making. The result is often incomplete visibility. The archive provides access to a substantial amount of material, but it also highlights the existence of gaps, and those gaps have become one of the most debated aspects of the release. Throughout the archive, researchers encounter familiar black bars: redactions, names removed, locations concealed, operational details withheld, technical information omitted. This should not surprise anyone. Governments routinely redact information for legitimate reasons: national security, intelligence sources, military capabilities, foreign partnerships, operational methods. The existence of redactions does not automatically imply a cover up, but it does create uncertainty because the public cannot fully evaluate information that remains partially hidden, and uncertainty has always occupied the center of the UFO conversation. Some researchers argue that reductions are entirely reasonable. Others argue they conceal information critical to understanding specific incidents. Both perspectives continue fueling debate. Perhaps more significant than reductions are references to records that appear entirely absent. Throughout the archive, investigators occasionally encounter indications that additional material once existed: supporting documentation or related investigations, supplementary reports. Yet not all of those records appear publicly available. And this raises important questions. Were the records never preserved? Were they lost? Were they destroyed? Do they remain classified? Or do they exist somewhere outside the scope of the current release process? Because it does not provide answers, speculation inevitably follows. One of the most anticipated aspects of the archive involved claims surrounding alleged crash retrieval programs. For decades, rumors have circulated regarding recovered craft. recovered materials, recovered technologies, and even alleged non human artifacts. Many expected the archive would finally resolve those questions. It did not. Researchers searching for definitive confirmation found none. Researchers searching for definitive disapproval found none either. Instead, the archive largely reflects investigations into sightings, observations, and anomalous events, not conclusive evidence supporting long standing crash retrieval narratives. This is important because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it evidence of confirmation. The archive leaves the questions largely where they existed before: contested, debated, unresolved. One of the more unusual developments during the disclosure era involved widespread public confusion regarding government websites. Many people assumed websites such as alien.gov and aliens.gov were somehow connected to UFO disclosure. Congressional officials later clarified that these websites have no connection to UAP investigations or disclosure efforts. Their purposes relate to an entirely different government functions, yet the confusion reveals something important. Public interest surrounding disclosure has become so intense that almost any public reference containing the word alien quickly attracts attention. The archive helps separate speculation from reality. It provides a concrete location where actual released UAP material can be examined, rather than relying on assumptions of internet rumors. Now, this may be the most important question raised by the archive. Why release these files now? Why this collection? Why this process? Supporters argue the archive represents a historic shift toward transparency. For decades, obtaining information required leaks, freedom of information requests, investigative journalism, whistleblower testimony. Now, material is being released proactively, organized, searchable, publicly accessible. That represents a significant change. Critics, however, see the situation differently. They argue that the archive reflects controlled disclosure, a carefully managed process designed to release information while maintaining control over the broader narrative. Not necessarily deception, not necessarily concealment, but management. And that distinction matters because institutions rarely surrender control of information voluntarily, especially when national security considerations remain involved. After reviewing the documents, a surprising conclusion begins to emerge. The most significant revelation may not involve extraterrestrials at all. It may involve institutions. The archive demonstrates that governments took these observations more seriously than many people assumed, not because they confirmed extraordinary explanations, but because uncertainty itself required investigation. The files revealed decades of effort, reports, analysis, assessment, reviews, investigations. The image that emerges is not one of certainty, it is one of persistence. Government repeatedly encountered observations that required attention. Sometimes explanation followed, sometimes they did not, but the investigations continued. Perhaps that is the most fitting way to view the archive, not as the conclusion of a mystery, but as evidence of its evolution. For decades, UFOs existed largely outside official institutions. Today, they exist inside them. Congress discusses them, scientists study them, military organizations investigate them, dedicated officers analyze them, archive release records relating to them. The transformation alone is historic. Regardless of where future evidence ultimately leads, the unexplained has moved from the margins into the mainstream, and that shift may prove more significant than any individual document. The Department of War archive does not provide a final answer. It does not confirm extraterrestrial visitation. It does not resolve every historical case. It does not eliminate uncertainty. What it provides is something arguably more valuable: visibility. For the first time, large portions of the investigative process have become available for public examination. Researchers can study the documents, journalists can evaluate the evidence, citizens can examine the records directly, And perhaps most importantly, future releases may continue expanding the picture because the archive was never presented as a finished collection. It is a process, an evolving release, a continuing effort. And that means the story is still being written. As new files emerge, new questions will follow. Some mysteries may be resolved, others may deepen. But one thing is certain, the conversation has changed. The unexplained is no longer hidden entirely behind closed doors. It now exists in public view, open to examination, open to scrutiny, and open to interpretation. This has been UFO to UAP, the evolution of the unexplained. I'm your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for joining me. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, the most interesting mysteries are often not the answers we discover, but the questions that refuse to disappear.